if you can eat the frog for your manager, that is 100% the best way to create a lot of value, even if you aren't necessarily experienced or knowledgeable at your job. Having that executional rigor is important, but what's even more important is, so let's talk about what you can do as a early career professional, or maybe you're like a fresh grad or a student, and you have very little experience, you've just started a new job, and if you're like less than 5 years out of undergrad, then I would consider that to be like an early stage professional. A lot of times when you're an early stage professional, you feel intimidated in the workplace, or you see these people at work, maybe it's your boss, maybe it's other coworkers that have been around for a long time, and it feels like they know so much more than you. And I clearly remember when I started my first job in investment banking out of undergrad, I had done an internship before, but that in no way prepared me for working full time because the experience is just so much different. It's not like 8 weeks in the summer where, you're getting given small, not really like impactful tasks, but now you're like fully employed, and there's a lot of imposter syndrome I find that people experience because you feel like you bring nothing to the table. And today I want to talk about this topic of being new and inexperienced because I'm now closing in on 4 years out of undergrad, and I've worked in 3 different jobs across 3 different industries. First year was in investment banking, and then 2 years were spent after that in management consulting, and the most recent year was spent here at Google. By the way, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt. I'm currently working in strategy and ops at Google, and before that I was a management consultant at BCG. But with that being said, as I mentioned, I think there's 3 things that a new hire can possibly bring to a company to bring immediate value to the table. The first is subject matter expertise. So this is like maybe you're an industry vet and you've worked for 10 years in the chemicals industry. And so you go to another chemicals company, a manufacturer perhaps, and from day one you can offer value because you know a lot about that particular subject. Or maybe, you did your PhD in a specific topic, then you go work at a company that specifically specializes in that. So you're bringing subject matter expertise from day one. The second is executional rigor. And this is how do you execute on processes and how do you just get shit done at work? Are you good at managing people and can you run a work stream all by yourself without help? The third is what I call energy, or like a good attitude. And I think a good attitude is maybe a little bit limiting. Energy, I would more broadly categorize as like the kind of mentality that you bring to all of your actions and interactions with people. So you're bringing a kind of like type A energy to the table, and you're being super proactive, going out of your way to do stuff that isn't expected maybe, and you're just grinding, for lack of a better term. And so I want to talk a little bit more about each of these. I think most people, if you're like me and you're less than 5 years out of undergrad, or you've spent less than 3 to 5 years in a specific industry, then you're not going to bring all 3 of the things that I just mentioned to your next job. At best, you're going to bring 2 out of the 3. Let me explain. So when I joined the investment bank out of college, I graduated with a degree in finance, but quite frankly, I didn't know much about M&A. And whatever I thought I knew was a lot less than how much you actually need to know eventually when I got to the job and I realized, I have no clue what's going on. And it was a really humbling moment. But basically what I'm trying to say is I lacked subject matter expertise about mergers and acquisitions. Quite frankly, I also lacked a bit of executional rigor as well, because even though at that time I could use Excel without touching the mouse, and I was good at aligning logos in PowerPoint, I wasn't good at managing a work stream. And so in an M&A deal, for example, the buyer does what's known as due diligence on the target, usually your client if you're on the sell side. And this involves coordinating with a lot of different parties. As the banker, you're basically like a quarterback, coordinating with lawyers, consultants, the buyer, maybe other third parties that the buyer has hired to do different types of diligence. And As a first-year analyst, I was just really, really bad at managing those processes without having help from, say, a senior analyst or the associate. And so the only thing I could really bring to the table was this positive attitude, this coachable attitude, bringing energy and making myself available basically 24/7, which in hindsight was really, really bad for my mental health. But that's kind of the expectation when you're in a job like investment banking. Now, when I transferred over to BCG, I brought a little bit more executional rigor to the table now, right? Because I had some experience managing work streams. But honestly, I did not have subject matter expertise still, because 1 year in a role is not really long enough to develop significant subject matter expertise. And also consultants, strategy consultants at a firm like BCG or McKinsey, you're generalist, which is a nice way of saying that you're not a specialist in anything. And so you're, as they say, 1,000 feet wide and 1 inch deep, meaning you don't have deep subject matter expertise on anything. And quite frankly, I think there's this big misconception that 22 or 23-year-old consultants are giving advice to Fortune 500 CEOs, and that, quite frankly, that's not the case. The partner on the project, who may have worked in that industry for a decade or has done numerous projects in one specific industry, they're the ones that are going to be giving advice to the C-suite. So as a junior consultant, you're just like the PowerPoint Excel monkey, and you're making sure that nobody's getting distracted in the meetings by uneven-sized font or off-centered tables, for example. And so while I continued to develop these skills of being more rigorous with my execution, and I also continued to bring a positive attitude and a can-do attitude to my work when I was in consulting, I still did not have any sort of subject matter expertise because I was a junior consultant. Now, fast forward to today, I'm now at Google, and in my first year, I'm coming up on completing my first year now, I struggled a lot. And if I reflect on the past year, especially the first 6 months, I had a really, really hard time. And I've realized that it's because when you work in a role like internal strategy, for example, or biz ops, whatever you want to call it, having that executional rigor is important. But what's even more important is the relationships with people at the company, because the role is really cross-functional. Cross-functional, if you don't know what that means, is just a fancy way of saying, oh, you have to work with a lot of different teams that aren't necessarily in your function. So if you're in strategy, then you work with product, marketing, sales, and all these other teams across the company. And if you're new, then obviously you don't have pre-existing relationships. So it's really hard to get stuff done because you have to go out and ask people for things in order to get your work done. Let me give you an example. Say I want to put together a business case for a new product line. Now, I can take the Excel skills that I've learned from banking and consulting, and I can build a fancy-looking PowerPoint spreadsheet that, feels like a Mercedes, and I can plug in a bunch of dummy numbers so that there's hockey stick revenue projections. But at the end of the day, I have to go and talk to product, sales, marketing to understand the actual costs of doing something like this, and also what it will actually take to successfully launch a new product. And that requires a lot of conversations with different people. And your life is going to be really, really hard if you don't have good relationships with those people. So if I'm not able to get the inputs that I need from these cross-functional stakeholders of mine, then how on earth can I go into a meeting with a director or a VP at a FANG company and confidently defend the business case that I'm presenting to them, right? It's a little bit of a predicament. Now, I want to take a step back, though, and I just want to say that, look, if you're in a junior role, nobody's going to expect you to have subject matter expertise. That takes time. The relationships, they also take time. But I want to talk about the other two things that you can do to do a good job and start on the right foot. And so the first one I mentioned is you need to bring the energy. So a BCG project leader that I worked with once told me, when you're new, you don't have a ton to offer, so you need to bring the energy. And it sounds so simple. Like, no duh, Matt. I'm going to bring the energy, and I'm going to have a positive attitude when I go to work today. But you'd be surprised. Give it a month, give it 3 months, give it 6 months. And you'd be surprised how few people actually do this because it's exhausting. I mean, you have to be that guy or that girl that constantly follows up with people. You're the guy or girl bringing that type A mentality, as I mentioned. You are trying to speak first in meetings, and you're being super proactive, proposing solutions instead of just bringing problems. You are that person that is raising issues when no one else is raising them, and you are that person who responds really quickly to pings and emails. It's really tiring, and honestly, I don't recommend it to everyone, but someone once told me that if you are looking to get promoted or you're just looking to have a really good first impression on people at work, then this is one of the ways to do it. Because when you consistently operate at an above average energy level for people at your level of tenure, right? Like you're competing against people that are also your age, right? So a few years or maybe a year out of college, then people notice. And they start to say things and describe you like, oh, he's a really hard worker, or he has a really good attitude, or he's a team player, that kind of thing. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, oh, wow, like that sounds like a recipe for burnout. And that's a whole topic for another video. Today, what I'm talking about is purely how can you bring value to a new job, even if you're young and people view you as inexperienced and you lack that subject matter expertise and the relationships that people who have been at the company for, say, a decade will have over you. And so the energy is number one. You want to be seen as hungry. The second piece, which is improving your execution, kind of is tied to the energy, because if you dial up the energy, then you're going to be a lot more focused at work. And that means you're going to start seeing improvements, because it's just impossible that you wouldn't improve if you're spending a lot of time and focus at work. And so you're probably still making mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, even today, but because you're more productive, you're going to learn faster. And because you're more proactive and you're probably talking to more people and learning from people who are a few steps ahead of you. And I think the biggest key here is you just don't want to be lazy. And what this means is if you're creating a presentation or you're building some kind of analysis, you should always be putting yourself in the shoes of your manager or even the person who's your manager's manager and thinking about, okay, what is the purpose of this request? Why am I working on this presentation? Who is the audience for this presentation? What's the purpose of the meeting? And are we trying to get something out of the audience from this meeting? Is it we're just trying to get them to agree to something, or are we trying to prove them wrong? Like, what is the actual goal of this meeting? And you want to assume more ownership rather than less. And this is something that I took a while to really understand early on. Ownership is about taking on more responsibility even when something is not necessarily your thing. Now, I don't mean you go out there and you try to start being all nosy and taking over other people's work, right? Like you're just going to piss people off if you do that. What I mean is if there is a way for you to make your manager's life a little bit easier, I think there's a term called eating the frog. If you can eat the frog for your manager, then that is 100% the best way to create a lot of value, even if you aren't necessarily experienced or knowledgeable at your job. And so a good example of demonstrating ownership is something like, say, for example, you're working on a presentation and you need something from someone else and you ask them to create a slide, for example, and they drop their stuff in and they say, okay, I'm all done. And you say, thanks. Now, one person might just assume that whatever that person worked on was fine and just think to themselves, oh, well, if there's questions about that slide, then, it's their problem, right? Because it's their content. But if you're the one who's owning the presentation, then it's your responsibility basically to look through everything in the deck, even things that you didn't write, and read and reread it again to make sure that it fits into the entire presentation and that it flows properly. And don't get me wrong, that takes a lot of work and it's exhausting and it's tiring. And at this point, some of you might be thinking, man, this doesn't sound worth it. Like, this sounds so tiring and it's not even guaranteed that I'm going to get promoted or that people will like me. Like, I can't control what people think, and this is just too much, right? But here's the thing. I think with corporate jobs, sometimes people really, really want their corporate job to be like this source of meaning and this source of fulfillment. And the truth is, most corporate jobs aren't set up that way. They're not designed to be inherently meaningful and fulfilling to most people. That's why you don't see everyone smiling on their way to work on Monday morning. But that said, I think that it's important not to be too negative about your work, because if you swing to the other side of the spectrum, which is apathy and detachment, and you say to yourself, oh, I don't care about work. Like, work is just work. Like, I don't care. I'm just going to like do whatever I can until 5 p.m. and then I'm just like going to clock out. Well, personally, what I've found is that I'm actually more unhappy when I'm detached from my work and I am apathetic. And I went through a whole phase of this last year where I was getting really upset because I had landed these prestigious jobs, and when I worked them, I realized I'm not happy and I'm not fulfilled by this job. And I didn't know what to do. And for a while, I wanted to be just apathetic, right? And I took that approach of trying to be detached. But the problem is, if you're spending 40, 50, even 60 hours a week at your job, that is a lot of time to be dissociating from the present. And it's actually a pretty miserable experience, in my opinion. And so what I found is that I actually feel, maybe happy isn't the right word, but I feel more satisfied when I'm working hard at my job, even if maybe I don't see myself in that particular role for the long run. There is this inherently human desire for us to feel useful. And there's actually this journalist who talked to a lot of war veterans after they came back from war, like horrible war zones where they would see people dying and they would see like their best friend getting shot or blown up by a mine. And even when they came back and they had PTSD, for some reason, some of them still wanted to go back to the war zone. And the reason for this is they felt like, at least when they were at war, they were serving some kind of purpose and they felt useful. And this might sound a little bit like an edge case, and you might be like, oh, Matt, come on. Like, you're telling me about like a wartime situation. I'm talking about work. But I think it doesn't just apply to people who've gone to war. I think all of us deep down want to feel useful, even if it's just like helping out someone on the street or our manager with a small task. There is this inherent value to us in working hard and doing a good job. And I think the other reason why being detached and apathetic from my work felt so bad to me was also it didn't align with my internal vision of who I am as a person. Like, for example, I have this internal script that says Matt is a hard worker. He tries his best in everything he does, no matter how large or small. And I'm sure that if you're watching this video, you have some version of this internal script in your mind as well, which is like the ideal version of yourself is doing this certain thing. And when you do things that don't align up with that ideal version of yourself, then you're actually like damaging your self-esteem in a way. And so this kind of got a little bit more philosophical than I was trying to get. But the point that I'm trying to drive across is, look, it's not supposed to be easy when you're starting out and when you're young and you're inexperienced and maybe you've just started a new job. It's not supposed to be easy, and just recognizing that it's okay to feel crappy and maybe you'll even feel useless at times in the beginning when you're still learning. You got to stick to the process and remember that, look, the relationships and the expertise, it comes with time, and you can lean in to the energy that you bring, and you can lean into the executional rigor that you can also deliver on day one. And so that's what I'll leave you guys with today. If you found this one helpful, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.